Harrison Ford, a living legend of American cinema, the man who has carried on his shoulders more than 4 decades of unshakable fame and become the symbol of a type of hero that the whole world believes is real. From the defiant nonchalance of Han Solo to the indomitable spirit of Indiana Jones, he has walked across the brightest stages on the planet with a kind of strength that is not loud, not flashy, but enough to make millions of people trust and admire him. He is not perfect, he is not approachable, but he is someone the audience always feels they can rely on. A model of resilience, of courage, and of a generation of men who never allow themselves to collapse in front of the world. In the eyes of the public, Harrison Ford has never been someone who falls apart. He has no loud falls, no career-destroying scandals, no moments where the whole world sees him shatter. But that very thing hides another truth, a truth that few people realize, or perhaps have never been close enough to understand. Because behind the halo of a legend is a story that is not glamorous, not dramatic in the way people usually expect, but quiet, prolonged, and heavy in a different way. A childhood that was not lacking in material things, but lacked the warmth necessary for a child to learn how to feel and express. A strict father whose rare recognition became something he had to chase for many years afterward. The early years in Hollywood, where he was not clearly rejected, but simply no one really saw him. Relationships that gradually cracked in silence when work, fame, and invisible distance began to take away things he did not realize he was losing. Children who grew up while he was somewhere else, playing the role of a hero the world needed, but not always the man his family needed. And all of that did not happen in one explosive moment, but accumulated over the years, quietly, persistently, and harder to notice than any tragedy. Harrison Ford is not someone who was destroyed in public. He is someone who never let himself collapse in front of others, and perhaps that is exactly why no one realized that he has never truly been relieved. Now, at 83, when his steps slow down, when his body no longer responds as before, when action scenes have given way to longer silences than ever, the question is no longer how much he has achieved, but what he has had to carry with him. What really happened behind the image of a man the whole world believes cannot be defeated? And is it true that throughout his entire life, what we have always sensed but never dared to name is exactly the silence he has never escaped from? A silence not of weakness, but of a person who has become used to enduring too long, too deeply, to the point that even he himself no longer knows how to let it go. If this story makes you think differently about Harrison Ford, please hit subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the even deeper parts that follow. Many years before the world knew the name Harrison Ford, before the stage lights turned him into an icon, he was just a boy growing up in a family that, at first glance, had nothing to complain about. Not poor, not violent, no dramatic incidents serious enough to make outsiders stop and feel pity. But sometimes the lives that look the most stable carry the quietest voids within them. Harrison grew up in a house where everything was neatly arranged, but emotions were never truly spoken. His father was a man of discipline, of standards, of expectations that were never put into words but always present in the air. He was not a cruel father, not someone who beat or yelled, but he was also not someone who knew how to show love. Words of praise almost did not exist. Those rare nods became something a child had to remember, like a reward. And for Harrison, that gradually turned into a quiet, persistent question. Am I good enough, or am I just not enough to be seen? His mother was gentler, but that gentleness was not enough to make up for the invisible gap between father and son. No one intentionally hurt him, but no one really taught him how to understand his own emotions, or how to speak out the things that were being held inside. And so, a child began to learn how to adapt in the only way he knew, in silence. Harrison did not become rebellious. He did not break the rules. He did not try to attract attention. He just quietly observed, quietly listened, and quietly kept everything to himself. What he did not receive, he learned not to need. What he did not understand, he learned not to ask. Over time, that silence was no longer a choice, but became a part of who he was, deeply embedded in the way he thought, the way he reacted, and the way he connected, or did not connect, with those around him. At school, he was not the standout kid, not the top of the class, not the center of attention. He was simply someone who was there, but not really seen, and that feeling, strangely enough, became so familiar that he no longer questioned it. It became the default state, a way of existing. There was no moment in Harrison's childhood when everything collapsed. There was no day when his life changed completely. But precisely because of that, the feeling of lack never had a clear beginning, and never had an end either. It did not come like a storm. It came like a light rain, lasting for many years, gradually soaking into everything. While other children learned to believe in themselves, Harrison learned to doubt himself. While others sought recognition, he learned to convince himself that he did not need it, or at least had to learn to live without it. But deep inside, that question never disappeared. It just became quieter, hidden deeper, but always there. Am I good enough, or have I just never been enough to be told that I am worthy? And that is exactly what makes this story painful in its own, very unique way. Because there are people who are not broken by one big event, but worn down by small voids, repeated over the years. Harrison Ford did not grow up in a tragedy that people could point to and name. He grew up in an absence that no one really noticed, and that very absence has followed him throughout his life, hiding behind his calm eyes, behind his tough exterior, behind the image of a man the whole world believes does not need anyone to exist. But the truth is, right from the early years of his life, he had already learned how to live without being heard. And sometimes, that leaves wounds deeper than any pain people can see. And perhaps it is from here that, when a child learns to be silent in order to survive, a person has begun to form. Not someone who will collapse in front of the world, but someone who will carry everything throughout his entire life without ever really knowing how to let it go. And then, when he left those years of youth with all the voids that had never been filled, Harrison Ford stepped into Hollywood, not as a conqueror, but as someone who was still searching to see if he really belonged there or not. He did not come with explosive confidence. He did not carry the feeling that he was born to become a star. He just came because it was a path he could try, an opportunity he could grasp, even though he himself was not sure if he was enough to reach the end of that road. The early years, Hollywood did not open its doors to welcome him. There were no dramatic rejections, no doors slamming shut in front of him in a clear way. Everything happened in a much harder-to-notice manner. He was given small roles, insignificant opportunities, appearances where even when he was present, people still did not really see him. He was not told that he was not good enough, but he was also never told that he was good enough. And in a world where attention is everything, not being noticed became a form of rejection more painful than any words. Harrison stood in those audition rooms, watching others walk past him, get the roles, move forward, get recognized. He saw them become what he had not even dared to believe he could become, not because they were clearly better than him, but because they were seen, while he was not. And that, over time, began to eat deep into his mind in a very familiar way. Just like the feeling from childhood, when he had once stood in a room where no one was really listening. Hollywood did not destroy him. It did not make him collapse. But it gradually made him lose something much more important, the belief that he could become something more. There was no moment when he decided to give up. But there was also no moment when he truly believed he would succeed. He continued to go, continued to try, continued to show up. But deep inside, a part of him had begun to accept that maybe he was just someone standing on the sidelines, someone who would never truly belong under the lights. Meanwhile, others moved forward. They were chosen. They were called by name. They were mentioned in conversations where he was not present. And each time like that, the gap between him and his dream grew a little bigger. Not a gap that could be measured, but a felt gap. A gap that made him begin to wonder if from the very beginning he had simply not been the one chosen. And then, like a familiar reflex, Harrison did what he always did when facing things he could not control. He stayed silent. He did not complain. He did not blame. He did not try to explain to the world that he deserved more. He just stepped back one step, observed, and continued to exist in a space where he was not sure he was really present or not. There are people who are clearly rejected, and they can resist, can fight, can stand up with an inspiring story. But there are people like Harrison Ford who are not clearly rejected, but overlooked, and that overlooking does not create a dramatic story. It creates a prolonged, simmering feeling that is hard to name. The feeling that whether he was there or not did not really matter. That is the feeling of being made invisible. And for Harrison, that was not a short phase. It was a state that lasted long enough to become a part of who he was. When you live too long in a world that does not see you, you begin to believe that you are not worth being seen. When you are not called by name, you begin to forget how to call your own name. And when you stand on the sidelines for too long, you begin to think that maybe that is the only place you belong. Harrison Ford did not leave Hollywood right away, but he was also no longer the person who believed that Hollywood would change his life. He continued to go, but without expecting any more. He continued to try, but without hoping too much. And it was precisely in that period, when he almost accepted being forgotten, that something began to change. But before the world finally saw him, before the name Harrison Ford became something no one could overlook, there was a long period of time where he existed without being recognized, where he walked without leaving a trace, where he lived in his own life, as if he was just someone standing outside, looking in. And perhaps those were the years that left the deepest imprint. Because success could come later. Fame could change everything, but the feeling of having once been made invisible never really disappears. It just becomes quieter, hidden deeper, and goes with him into everything that happened afterward. And then, when the feeling of being made invisible had become too familiar, when the doors did not slam shut but also never truly opened, Harrison Ford began to step onto a different path, not because he gave up on his dream, but because he needed to live. Hollywood did not feed him. The small roles were not enough to sustain a living. And so, he became a carpenter, not a romantic choice, not a symbolic decision, but simply a way to survive in an expensive and unforgiving city. He worked with his own hands, measuring, cutting wood, building frames, constructing spaces that others would call home. And ironically, it was during those years that he became a part of the lives he once thought he would belong to, not as an actor, but as the person standing behind, quietly contributing to the success of others. He repaired, he built, he finished the houses of people who had achieved what he was still searching for. The producers, the directors, the people in the industry, those who only needed one opportunity, one look, one word of recognition, could change his entire life. But in those rooms, he was not the one being noticed. He was the one carrying the tools, the one standing on the ladder, the one working in silence while conversations about cinema, about success, about opportunities took place around him as if he did not exist. And that was the tragedy in its own very unique way. Not being pushed out, but standing so close, yet never being allowed to step in. Harrison Ford, the man who would later become one of the most iconic faces of Hollywood, had once spent the most important years of his life building dreams for others, while his own dream was set aside day after day, like something that could wait, like something that was not urgent. He did not say that he had given up. He never officially left acting. But the reality was that the distance between him and his dream grew larger, not because he moved away from it, but because life forced him to prioritize other things: family, responsibilities, money, the practical things that a dream could not solve right away. And so, a part of him began to accept a possibility that before he had never dared to think about, that perhaps his life would not be the story he had once hoped for, that perhaps he would be an ordinary man, working hard, living a quiet life, and watching others become what he had once wanted to become. But what is worth saying is that even when standing in the middle of that choice, he still did not completely let go. He still kept a small part of the dream. Not big, not bright, just something that existed quietly, like a fire not strong enough to blaze, but also not completely extinguished. He continued to take small roles when he could. He continued to appear when there was an opportunity. But it all happened in a state where hope was no longer the main driving force. He no longer chased the dream with the intensity of youth. He just did not completely turn his back on it, and perhaps that was the most painful part of this period. Not failure, not giving up, but the prolonged delay, a state of being in between where he did not move forward, but also did not turn back. A life divided in two. During the day, he was a carpenter, building tangible things for others. At night, he was still someone attached to a dream he did not know if it still belonged to him or not. And throughout that time, no one stood outside looking in and said that this was an important chapter in the story of a legend. No one recorded it. No one waited. No one knew that the man holding the hammer, measuring wood, working in silence, would one day change the way the world looked at heroes on the screen. But Harrison Ford did not know that. And perhaps, precisely because he did not know, every day that passed in this period carried a very different feeling, not as preparation for success, but as adaptation to the possibility that success might never come. And if there is one thing that can most clearly define this period, then it is not failure, but the fact that a person spent the important years of his life building dreams for others, while his own dream was gradually pushed back, farther, fainter, and increasingly harder to grasp, until even he himself was no longer sure if it still truly existed or not. And then, at a time when he had almost gotten used to standing on the sidelines, when the dream was no longer something he clung to every day but only existed as a small part within him, the life of Harrison Ford suddenly turned in a direction that no one, including himself, could have predicted. A role appeared. Not a big role right from the start. Not an opportunity designed specifically for him. It was just a part in a project that at first he was not even the main choice for. But then, somehow, he became Han Solo, a character who would later not only define his career, but also become an inseparable part of global pop culture. And when Star Wars was released, everything changed almost overnight. The man who had once stood on a ladder, hammering wooden frames, now appeared on the big screen in front of millions of audiences. The man who had been forgotten became a face that no one could overlook. Success did not come like a slow flow, but like a big wave, sudden, powerful, sweeping everything along. Fame, money, attention, all the things he had lacked for many years now appeared all at once, with an intensity that no one could be prepared to receive. But inside, Harrison Ford did not change as quickly as the world around him. Because there is a truth that the stage lights never talk about. You can change a person's position in just one night, but you cannot change the person himself in just one night. The years of being overlooked, the voids from childhood, the feeling of not being good enough, the silence that had eaten deep into the way he saw himself, all of those things did not disappear just because the whole world began to call his name. He became a star, but he did not always feel he belonged in that position. He was seen, but not sure that he was understood. And that was precisely the paradox of success that came too late. When fame comes to young people, they grow up with it. They learn how to become the version the world expects while they themselves are still forming. But for Harrison, when the lights shone on him, the person inside had already been shaped for a very long time by silence, by self-doubt, by the years he learned to exist without needing recognition, and therefore, instead of naturally blending into fame, he kept a distance from it. He did not chase the lights. He did not try to become a star in the way Hollywood usually expected. He still kept his calmness, still kept his distance, still was the quiet man he had always been. That made him different, but it also made him harder to understand in the eyes of the public. People saw a confident, charismatic, full of personality Han Solo on screen, but in real life they saw a quiet, reserved, sometimes cold Harrison Ford, and the gap between those two images began to create a question that no one could really answer. Who is the real him? And perhaps even he himself was not entirely sure, because when you spend so many years not being seen and then suddenly become the center of attention, you not only have to learn how to live with fame, but also have to relearn how to see yourself. Harrison Ford never talked much about his emotions in that period. He did not share the moments of confusion, did not tell about the nights when everything became too fast, too big. But that silence once again said a lot, because it showed that even when he achieved what he had once pursued, he still had not completely escaped the person that the previous years had created. Success does not erase the past. It only places that past in a different context, where everything becomes clearer and sometimes also more painful. Because when you finally achieve your dream, you are forced to face a question that before you could avoid. Why do I still not feel whole? Harrison Ford had become a name that the whole world knew, but inside, he still carried questions that had never been answered. And perhaps that was exactly what created a special part of his appeal, a sincerity that could not be faked. A feeling that behind the image of the hero was a person still trying to understand himself. Success had come. The lights had shone on him. The world had finally seen him. But the question remained there. Quiet, persistent, not easy to disappear. Being seen, does it mean being understood? And if not, then everything he had achieved, in the end, had filled what in him, and what still remained empty, still untouched, still quietly existing behind the smile of a man the whole world believed had it all. And then, when the world still had not had time to fully understand the man behind Han Solo, a new chapter began, bigger, brighter, and also heavier in a way that few people realized. Harrison Ford was no longer just a star. He became Indiana Jones, an almost perfect symbol of a cinematic hero, brave, smart, never backing down, and always standing up after every fall. With Indiana Jones, he did not just play a role. He became part of collective memory, a symbol that many generations grew up with. And from that moment, Harrison Ford was no longer just a person. He became an icon. But it was right here that a quiet change began to take place. When a person becomes a symbol, the world no longer looks at them as a human being. People no longer seek the truth, but seek the image, no longer care about what they feel, but care about what they represent. And for Harrison, that meant that his real self gradually became hidden behind what the public believed he had to be. On screen, he was never afraid. In real life, he had no space to show fear. On screen, he always knew what he had to do. In real life, he was not sure where he was going, but the world did not wait for answers. The world had decided who he was, and from then on, he had to live in the shadow of that very image. Harrison Ford was not someone who sought attention. He did not actively build the hero image. But when fame reached that level, he no longer had complete control over how he was perceived. Every appearance, every role, Every interview all contributed to reinforcing an image he could not escape from. And over time, the boundary between the real person and the icon began to blur, not because he wanted to lose himself, but because he no longer had many other choices. When the whole world looks at you in a certain way, resisting it is not only difficult, but almost impossible, and that was when isolation began to appear. Not in a loud way, not as clear alienation, but as a quiet feeling that no one really knew who he was. Beyond what they had seen, the more famous Harrison Ford became, the greater the distance between him and those around him. Not because he changed completely, but because the world changed the way it looked at him. Relationships became more complicated, conversations became more cautious, and gradually he began to live in a space where everything was defined by fame. He was still himself, quiet, observant, keeping distance. But now those traits were no longer understood as before. They were interpreted, labeled, misunderstood. And that made him withdraw even more, not because he did not want to connect, but because he was not sure who was seeing the real him and who was only seeing the icon they wanted to believe in. There is a paradox that few people talk about. When you become someone everyone knows, you can feel less understood than ever. And for Harrison Ford, that paradox was not an abstract idea. It was a prolonged experience. He did not lose himself in one moment. He did not wake up one day and realize he had become someone else. Everything happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, one step at a time, one role at a time, 1 year passing. And then, at some point, the question was no longer who he had become, but how much of himself was left. Harrison Ford continued to work. He continued to succeed. He continued to be the person the world admired. But inside, a distance had formed between the person he once was and the image he was forced to carry. And that distance was not easy to fill, because when a person has lived too long in the role the world has assigned him, returning to himself is no longer simple. It requires letting go of things the whole world is honoring, and that is a price not everyone is willing to pay. Harrison Ford never talked much about this. He did not turn it into a story. He did not explain. But his silence, once again, said a lot. It showed that behind the image of a hero who never collapses is a person trying to hold on to the remaining parts of himself in a world that keeps turning him into something bigger, brighter, but also more unfamiliar. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of this period. Not that he became a legend, but that in order to become that legend, he gradually had to stand farther away from his real self, little by little, until even he himself was no longer sure where that distance began, and whether it would ever truly be narrowed again or not. And when the gap between the real person and the icon grew larger and larger, the first thing that began to be affected was not his career, but the closest relationships in Harrison Ford's life. Before he became an icon, before his name became tied to legends on the screen, he already had a private life, of family, a wife, a support he once believed would not change. His marriage to Mary Marquardt began in the years when he was still an unknown, when everything was simpler, when love was not dominated by stage lights or public attention. It was a relationship built before the world stepped into his life, before fame became an inseparable part. But precisely because of that, when fame arrived, it did not only change his life, but also changed the foundation of that relationship. Success did not destroy his marriage in a dramatic way. There was no single moment when everything collapsed. There was no event big enough to become a headline. Instead, everything happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, with each passing day. The work schedule became denser. The trips became longer. The periods of separation stretched longer. And along with that, something else began to appear, an invisible distance between two people who had once been very close. Harrison Ford was not someone who found it easy to share. He was not the type to say out loud what he was feeling. And when the pressure of fame began to build up, when the roles, the expectations, the public images weighed heavily on him, he did what he had always done since he was a child. He kept everything inside, but in a relationship, silence is not always strength. Sometimes it is distance, and that distance, if not filled, would gradually become a void that no one knew how to cross. Rumors began to appear. The relationship between him and Carrie Fisher during the filming of Star Wars was no longer a secret, even though it happened in a complicated context. Even though both of them were in positions where emotions were not always clear, the truth was still that it existed, and when things like that happened, they did not only create clear cracks, but also deepened the cracks that had already existed before. Harrison Ford's marriage did not end in one explosive moment. It ended the way it had gradually changed, quietly, prolonged, and irreversible. Not because of a lack of affection, but because the things that once held the two of them together were no longer enough to withstand the changes that fame brought. And that was what made this period painful in its own very unique way, because there was no one to blame completely. There was no clear villain. Only time, distance, and the things left unsaid gradually dissolved a relationship that had once been very real. Harrison Ford did not talk much about that marriage after it ended. He did not explain. He did not justify. But in that silence, something began to appear: regret. Not regret in the loud way, not regret spoken out loud, but a quiet feeling that there were things, once lost, that would never come back. Success continued to arrive. Fame continued to grow. But somewhere in his life, a part had closed. And what is worth saying is that no one really stopped to ask what that meant to him, because when a person becomes an icon, the world usually only cares about what they have achieved, not what they have lost on the way there. Harrison Ford continued to move forward. He was still the hero on the screen, still the name that everyone admired. But behind all of that, a question began to form. Not big, not clear, but enough to exist. Was all of this worth it? And that question, like many other things in his life, was never answered directly. It just stayed there, quietly, as a part of who he was, as something he carried. Not to speak out, but only to remember that some victories in life always come with losses that no one sees. And from that moment, regret was no longer a distant idea. It became something very real, very close, very hard to name, but also very hard to forget. And then, when the cracks in the marriage gradually became irreversible, another role in Harrison Ford's life was also quietly challenged in a way that no lights could hide: the role of a father. He had children. He loved them in his own way. But that love, like many other things in his life, was not always expressed in a way that others could see or feel. When his career began to explode, when the films came one after another, when filming schedules, promotional schedules, and long trips from one city to another country became the daily rhythm of life, time, the one thing that could not be duplicated, began to become something he no longer controlled. And in that division, family gradually became the place he returned to, but not always truly present. Harrison Ford was not an absent father in the complete sense. He was still there, still provided, still made sure his children had everything they needed to grow up. But there was a difference that not everyone noticed right from the start between being there and being present. And over time, that difference began to become clearer. He did not grow up in an environment where emotions were easily spoken. He was not taught how to express love through words, through clear gestures. And so, when he became a father, he carried with him everything he had learned or not learned from the past. He took care. He protected. But he did not always know how to tell his children that he was proud of them. He did not always know how to stop in the middle of busyness to listen, to truly be present in the small but important moments. And that did not happen in one day. It was not a conscious decision. It was the result of a chain of small choices, repeated, a postponed call, a trip extended, an evening when he could not return on time. And little by little, a distance began to form. Not loud, not dramatic, no big arguments, just a quiet separation, growing with time, just like the way he had once grown up with voids in his own childhood. What made this even more painful was that Harrison Ford was not someone who did not care. He was not someone who coldly put work above family on purpose. He worked because that was what he had always done, from the days when he was still a carpenter, when every hour of work was necessary to sustain life. But when work was no longer a matter of survival, but became part of fame, of responsibility, of the image the world expected, he still continued with the same rhythm, without realizing that the price had changed. The years passed. The children grew up. The moments he missed did not come back. And then, at some point, awareness began to appear, not like a shock, but like a slow, unavoidable realization that there were things in life that could not be replaced by anything else. That providing, no matter how important, could never replace presence. That the memories children needed were not just what he had done for them, but the moments he had been there with them. But realizing that often came too late to completely change what had already happened. Harrison Ford did not talk much about this. He did not turn it into a public story, but in the way he lived later, in the way he tried to slow down, in the way he looked back at what had passed, one thing could be seen. He understood that there were parts in his life that he had not been able to hold on to the way he wanted. And like many other things, he carried that understanding, in silence. Not to blame himself, not to seek forgiveness, but simply to accept that there were roles in life without a script, without instructions, and without a perfect second chance. And if there is one thing this period left behind, then it is not a clear failure, but a quiet lesson, a truth he had to experience himself to understand, that sometimes the most important thing a father can give his children is not what he can bring home, but his own presence, in the moments that later nothing can replace. And when he realized that, the question was no longer how much he had done, but what he had missed, and whether any part of it could still be repaired, or had become a part of the past that he could only carry quietly, like so many other things in his life. And then, when the distances in the role of father had not yet been repaired, when the things left unsaid still lay quietly in the long silences, another relationship in Harrison Ford's life also gradually reached the point of no return: his marriage to Melissa Matheson. Unlike what the public usually imagines about breakups in Hollywood, there was no loud storm, no sensational headlines stretching over many months. There was no single moment when everything shattered in front of the world's eyes. Instead, everything happened in the way Harrison had become too familiar with, quietly, prolonged, and almost no one really noticed until it had become an unchangeable truth. His second marriage, just like the first one, was not lacking in affection in the early days. It was built in the period when he was already a star, but still close enough to his real self to believe that he could balance fame and personal life. But over time, the familiar pressures returned: work, public image, the endless demands from a career that had become the center of everything. And like before, the things left unsaid began to accumulate. Not big arguments, not irreconcilable conflicts right away, but small, repeated, prolonged distances. Until they were no longer small, Harrison Ford was not someone who easily shared what was happening inside him. He was not the type to sit down and explain every emotion, every worry, every pressure he was carrying. And when those pressures increased, when fatigue was no longer just physical, but became a prolonged state, he did what he had always done. He kept everything inside. But that silence in a relationship was not always protection. Sometimes it was withdrawal. And when one person withdrew while the other was still trying to hold everything together, the distance was no longer something that could be filled by time. It became a crack that both could see but did not know how to repair. The divorce from Melissa Matheson did not change Harrison Ford's image in the eyes of the public. He was still the star, still the hero, still the name that people trusted and admired. No collapse was broadcast, no moment when the whole world stopped to witness him losing an important part of his life. But precisely because of that, what happened inside became even harder to notice. Because there are collapses that do not need noise. There are losses that do not need witnesses. And there are moments when a person realizes that a part of his life has ended, without anyone standing there to ask how he felt. Harrison Ford continued to work. He continued to appear on screen, continued to complete the roles the world expected. But amid all of that, a different feeling began to become clearer: loneliness. Not the loneliness of someone who had no one around. He always had people, colleagues, fans, family, but it was the loneliness of a person who was no longer sure that anyone truly understood what he was going through. When you are at the peak of your career, when everything on the outside seems perfect, admitting that inside you are falling apart becomes harder than ever, not because you do not want to speak, but because you do not know if anyone is willing to listen, or if they would believe that it is real. And so, like many times before in his life, Harrison Ford chose silence. He did not turn the pain into a story. He did not seek sympathy from the public. He just continued. But continuing did not always mean being okay. Sometimes it only meant that you were carrying everything, day by day, without stopping to face it. And that was exactly what made this period heavy in a way that was very hard to describe. Because on the outside, nothing changed significantly. But inside, a structure had collapsed, a relationship had ended, a part of his life had closed, and none of that was marked by a clear moment. No starting point, no ending point, only a transition that he had to realize by himself, accept by himself, and carry by himself. Harrison Ford was not the only one who went through things like this, but in his case, there was one thing that made it different: the contrast between what the world saw and what was really happening. A man at the peak of his career, but inside feeling that a part of himself had just collapsed. A person everyone believed had it all, but was losing things that no one saw. And perhaps, precisely in that contrast, a truth began to become clearer than ever. Not every collapse is loud. Not every loss needs to be witnessed, and not every pain is shared. There are things that simply happen, in silence, in the shadows of a life that the world continues to look at as if everything is still fine. And Harrison Ford, once again, was the one carrying all of that, without ever really speaking it out. And after everything that had happened, the cracked relationships, the distances that could not be filled, the losses no one saw, one thing became clearer than ever in Harrison Ford's life. The problem was not that he had no emotions, but that he had never really known how to bring them out. From the years of childhood, when silence was the only way to survive in an environment lacking expression, to the early years in Hollywood, when not being seen made him learn to withdraw into himself, Harrison gradually formed an almost instinctive reaction, keeping everything inside, not because he wanted to hide, but because that was the only thing he knew. And over time, that did not just become a habit, but became a structural part of who he was. To the public, Harrison Ford was often perceived as a cold man, quiet, sometimes distant, short interviews, emotionless answers, and gaze that people easily interpreted as indifference. But what people saw was not the whole story, because behind that exterior was a complex inner world, full of thoughts, full of emotions only, not expressed in the way the world was familiar with. He was not someone who did not feel pain. He was not someone who did not know love, did not know regret, did not know fear, but those emotions, instead of being spoken, shared, released, were kept inside, accumulated, and gradually became something like a prison, an inner space where he both lived in it and could not escape from it. There is a paradox in the way people perceive emotions. If you do not show them, people assume you do not have them. If you stay silent, people assume you do not care. And Harrison Ford, for many years, had lived in exactly that paradox. He did not speak out what he felt, and therefore, people did not know what he was feeling. But not being understood made him withdraw even more. A loop with no clear ending. In relationships, this became an almost invisible but extremely strong barrier. Not a lack of affection, but a lack of connection. Because emotions, if not shared, cannot become a bridge between two people. And when that lasted, the distance was no longer just about time or space, but about understanding each other. Harrison Ford was not someone who did not want to connect, but he did not have the language to do it in the way others expected. And that made him, even when surrounded by many people, still feel like he was standing alone in his own world. It can be said that throughout his life he had built a very strong image on the outside, a man who was not easily shaken, not easily hurt, not easily affected. But inside there was another part apart that was not weak, but not released. A part that knew how to feel, but did not know how to express. And that very separation created a very special form of tragedy. Not that he lacked emotions, but that he could not share them in a way the world could understand. This not only affected his relationships, but also affected the way he saw himself. When you cannot speak out what you feel, you gradually lose the ability to identify them clearly. Emotions become vague. Pain becomes hard to name. And over time, you begin to live with a state where everything exists, but nothing is fully resolved. Harrison Ford never stood in front of the public and said he was hurting. He did not talk about the nights when everything became too heavy. He did not share the moments when he felt lost in his own life. But that did not mean those moments did not exist. It only meant he had chosen, or was forced to choose, a different way to live with them. A silent way. An internal way. A way that no one but him could truly understand. And perhaps that was exactly what made his story sad in its own very unique way. Because there are people who are not destroyed by what they go through, but imprisoned by the way they have to face them. Harrison Ford did not lose his emotions. He did not become empty. On the contrary, he felt a lot. But all of that existed in a space he could not easily open. And when a person lives too long in that emotional prison, escaping is no longer a simple choice. It becomes something almost impossible. And therefore, for many years, Harrison Ford continued to walk, more successful, more famous, more admired, but inside, still carrying a part of himself that no one really saw, no one really touched, and perhaps even he himself no longer knew how to bring it into the light. And then, after many years of living in a world where emotions were always kept behind a shell of silence, a moment came, not loud in the way of fame, but strong enough to slow everything down, forcing Harrison Ford to face what he had always kept at a distance, the finiteness of himself. In 2015, when he was piloting the vintage airplane he often flew as part of his private passion, everything went as usual, until it no longer did. The engine failed, the familiar sound disappeared. There was no more thrust, no clear choice. Only a very short period of time where everything had to be decided in absolute silence. No audience, no script, no chance to redo. He was forced to make an emergency landing on a golf course, a decision that many later called instinct, but in that moment, it was only the one choice to survive. The impact happened. Metal shattered, his body suffered serious injuries, and in one moment, Very short, but long enough to change the way a person looks at life-death, was no longer a distant concept. It was there, close enough to not be denied. But what is worth saying is that there was no recounted panic, no descriptions of fear beyond control. Instead, what appeared in the little he shared later was a very clear awareness, an understanding that did not need to be put into words, that everything could end at any time. And when you stand close to that boundary, the things you once thought were important begin to shift position, not because they lose value, but because you see them in a different light. Harrison Ford had lived almost his entire life with a feeling that he had to continue working, continue moving forward, continue keeping everything inside. But in that moment when time was no longer an endless stretch, but something that could be cut off at any time, the question was no longer how much he had done, but how he had truly lived. That accident did not turn him into a completely different person. He did not become someone who talked more. He did not suddenly open up to the world. He did not completely change the way he expressed himself. But one thing changed the way he looked at time, the way he looked at what was left, the way he understood that not everything could be postponed forever, that there were things, if not spoken, not done, not felt, might never have a second chance. The recovery process was not easy. The physical injuries reminded him every day that he was no longer invincible, that the body, like everything else, had limits. And for the first time in many years, Harrison Ford was no longer in the position of complete control. He had to stop. He had to slow down. He had to let time pass without being able to push it faster. And precisely in those silences, the thoughts he could previously ignore began to become clearer. Not big questions about fame or success, but smaller things, closer, more personal relationships, moments, things he had once thought he could come back to later. But later was no longer a certainty, and perhaps that was the real turning point of this period. Not the accident, not the injury, but the change in perception, a change that was not loud, not dramatic, but profound. Harrison Ford did not begin to talk about his life publicly. He did not turn that experience into a story to tell, but in the way he appeared afterward, in the way he chose what he did, in the way he seemed to value more the times he might have overlooked before, it could be seen that something had shifted. Not a rebirth, not a completely new beginning, but an adjustment small, but enough to change the direction of what remained. Because when a person has gone through almost their entire life, has carried so much without ever really stopping to look back, then sometimes just one moment like that one moment when death is close enough not to be ignored is enough to make them understand that time is no longer something that can be spent without thinking. And from then on, everything, even if not completely changed, was no longer the same as before. Harrison Ford remained himself, still quiet, still reserved, still the man the world found hard to understand. But after that moment, perhaps, for the first time in many years, he did not just continue walking, but began to be more clearly aware of where he was going and what was truly important in the remaining path. And after the moment when death had come close enough not to be ignored, something else began to appear more clearly in Harrison Ford's life, not fear, but time. No longer an abstract concept, no longer something existing far away, but a slow, steady flow that could not be stopped, quietly taking away each part that he had once taken for granted. The injuries accumulated over many years from action scenes, from accidents, from the life he had lived fully began to leave clearer marks. His body no longer responded as before. Movements that had once been instinctive now became something to consider. Things that had once been easy now required effort. And each time like that, a truth became clearer. He was no longer the man the world had once seen on screen. Harrison Ford had once been the image of resilience, of strength, of a person who could stand up after any fall. But now, not every fall could be overlooked. Not every wound disappeared with time, and not everything could be held onto by willpower alone. This did not happen in one day. It did not come as a shock. It came the way time always comes, slowly, patiently, and unavoidably. One day, he realized he needed more time to recover. Another day, he realized there were things he could no longer do as before. And then, at some point, that realization was no longer scattered moments, but became a continuous state, a part of life. What made this difficult was not the physical change, but the way those changes touched deeper things, the things that had once defined him. Because for Harrison Ford, the body was not just a means. It was part of the image he had carried for many decades. A man of action. A man who did not back down. A man who could overcome any challenge. And when the body began to no longer keep up with that image, the question was not only, what can I do, but who am I still? But unlike many people, Harrison Ford did not react to this change with loud resistance. He did not deny it. He did not try to prove he was still the same at all costs. Instead, he faced it in the way he had faced many other things in his life, quietly, not accepting it immediately, not without difficulty, but a gradual process of understanding that there were things that could not be kept forever. That strength was not always in continuing as before, but sometimes in knowing when to change. Harrison Ford continued to work. He still appeared. He still carried a part of the image the world was familiar with. But inside, he knew that everything was no longer the same as before. And that was not a failure. It was a transition, a stage that no one could avoid, but not everyone was ready to face. Because there is one thing no one can defeat: time. You can delay it. You can ignore it for a while, but in the end, it is still there, waiting patiently, without hurry, but never stopping. And when it begins to take away the things you once saw as part of yourself, you are forced to learn how to live with what remains. Harrison Ford did not talk much about old age. He did not turn it into a topic. But in the way he moved, in the way he chose roles, in the way he appeared there, could be seen a change. Not weakness, but awareness, an understanding that the fight was no longer to prove anything to the world, but to harmonize with what was changing inside himself. And, perhaps, that was the hardest part, not losing what you once had, but learning how to redefine yourself when those things are no longer there. Harrison Ford is no longer the man of his peak years, but he is also not someone who has lost everything. He is a person going through a stage where everything is gradually given back to time, little by little, not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. And in that process, he did not try to resist. He just continued in a different way, because when you have gone far enough, have experienced enough, perhaps you understand that there are things that do not need to be won. They only need to be accepted, and time is one of them. And then, when time gradually took away what had once defined him, when the cracks of the past were still there but no longer loud as before, something else appeared in Harrison Ford's life. Not as a salvation, not as a miracle that erased everything, but as an opportunity to start again in a different way. The relationship with Callista Flockhart did not come at the time when he was at his peak, did not come when everything was still intact, but came after he had gone through the losses, the breakages, the distances he could not go back to repair. And perhaps precisely because of that, it did not carry the innocence of the first beginnings. It carried awareness. It carried experience. It carried experience. It carried even the wounds that had not fully healed. Harrison Ford was no longer the young man trying to prove something to the world. He was also no longer in the position where everything revolved around his career. When he met Callista, He was already in a different stage where the questions were no longer, "What can I achieve?" but "What do I have left?" And in that space, love was no longer something bright and explosive, but something quieter, slower, and more real. Callista did not step into his life as someone who needed to be conquered. She stepped in as someone ready to be there, not for the image the world knew, but for the real person behind it. And that, for Harrison, was an unfamiliar experience, because for many years he had lived in a world where every relationship was affected by fame, by expectations, by what others thought he was. But here he did not need to play a role. He did not need to maintain an image. He did not need to become any version other than himself. That did not mean everything became easy. Harrison Ford did not suddenly change himself. He was still the man of few words. He was still the man who kept many things inside. But in this relationship, there was a small difference. He began to learn how to be present, not in a perfect way, not always correctly, but more clearly, more consciously. He began to understand that being there, truly being there, was more important than doing the right thing in the way he once thought. He slowed down, not because he no longer had a choice, but because he began to realize the value of not rushing. The moments that before he might have overlooked now became more meaningful, not because they were grand, but because they were real. And in that truth, there was something he had not had for many years, the feeling that he did not need to become someone else to be accepted. This relationship did not erase what had happened before. It did not change the past. It did not bring back the lost years. But it brought something else a space where he could exist without needing to defend himself constantly, where he could be himself without needing to explain. And for a person who had lived too long in silence and distance, that meant more than any perfection. Harrison Ford never said that he had been healed. And perhaps that was not the right word to describe it. Because there are wounds that do not disappear completely. There are things that cannot be fully repaired. But there is another form of healing, not erasing the pain, but learning how to live with it without letting it define the whole person. And perhaps that was exactly what he found in this relationship. Not a perfect ending, but a continuation, gentler, more honest, and with less pressure. A place where he did not need to chase an image, did not need to prove anything, did not need to keep everything inside absolutely. A place where silence no longer was distance, but could become mutual understanding. And in all that life had brought him fame, success, loss, regret, perhaps this was one of the rare things that came not to change him, but to allow him to be himself, in a way that before he had never really had the chance to experience. Not loud, not perfect, but real enough to become an important part of the remaining years. And sometimes, after everything that had happened, a love that came this late was not something you waited for, but something you needed at exactly the moment when you finally were ready to recognize its value. And then, when the years gradually drifted more toward the past than the future, when life was no longer about what was coming but about what had passed, Harrison Ford began to look back not in one single moment, not like a confession, but like a slow, quiet process where each memory returned in a way he could not control. There was no interview where he sat down and said he regretted something. There was no public list of mistakes, but in the way he lived, in what he chose to do, and sometimes in what he no longer did, one thing could be felt. There were things in his life that, if he could, he would have wanted to be different. Not his career, not the films, not the achievements the world still mentioned as irreplaceable milestones, but smaller things, closer things, more personal things. Family, time, moments that had passed and would never return. Because there is a truth no one tells you when you are on the road to success, that there are things you have to trade, and you do not always realize their value until they are no longer there. Harrison Ford had spent most of his life working, building, becoming the person the world saw. and he had done that far beyond what the boy back then had ever thought possible. But in that process, there were moments when he was not present, times when he was not there when his family needed him, conversations that never happened, opportunities to say something that in the end were kept inside. And what made these things heavy was not that they were wrong, but that they could not be changed. You can fix a mistake, you can apologize, you can start over, but you cannot go back to a moment that is past and live it differently. Time does not give a second chance in that way, and when you realize that, everything becomes clearer, not in a way that hurts you immediately, but in a way that makes you understand that there are parts of your life that will forever stay behind, unreachable anymore. Harrison Ford did not talk about his regrets, but he lived with them in a way that only those who were subtle enough could notice. He slowed down. He spent more time on things he might have overlooked before. He did not try to compensate in a loud way, did not try to repair the past with big actions, but there was a change, a clearer presence, more attention to what was happening around him. As if he understood that what remained was more important than ever. Success, in this period, no longer carried the same meaning as before. It was no longer something that needed to be achieved, no longer something that defined him. It was simply a part of the life he had lived, and when placed next to what had been lost, a question became unavoidable. Did all of that really make up for what was no longer there? And the answer, even though never spoken out loud, seemed to always lean to one side. Not because success had no value, but because there were things that success could not replace, could not buy back, could not recreate. Family is not a role that can be reshot from the beginning. Time is not something that can be extended when you are finally ready, and the moments when you are not present will always be there, like voids that cannot be completely filled. Harrison Ford did not let those things destroy him. He did not live in public torment, but he carried them with the way he had carried many other things in his life, quietly, without showing off, without explaining, simply existing with them. And perhaps that was exactly the emotional peak of this story. Not a collapse, not a tearful confession, but a profound, quiet, irreversible realization that there are things in life once they have passed that will never return. And the only thing you can do is to live with them in the best way possible in the remaining time. Harrison Ford had become everything the world once thought he could become. But when looking back, perhaps the most important thing was not how much he had achieved, but what he had lost along that path. And even though he never spoke it out, never wrote it down, never turned it into a story to tell in the way he existed today, one thing could be felt, that behind the image of a man who had it all was a person who understood very clearly the value of what he could not get back, and carried that regret not as a burden to be relieved, but as an inseparable part of who he was, until the end of his life. And then, when everything that had passed gradually settled down, when achievements no longer needed to be proven and losses could no longer be changed, Harrison Ford's story did not end with a big victory, but with a quiet truth that perhaps for many years we had always sensed but had never really named. He was not perfect, never. Not a man without mistakes, not a man who always made the right choices, not a man with a complete life in the way the world usually imagines legends. And he was also not invincible. He did not win everything. He did not keep all that he cherished. He did not avoid the distances, the losses, the things he could not go back to repair. But there was one thing he never did. He did not collapse. Not in the way the world could see, not in the way people could tell as a clear story. He did not shatter under the lights. He did not let what happened inside turn him into a completely different person on the outside. Instead, he did something much harder. He carried it all, piece by piece, through each year, through each role, through each relationship that came and went, through each moment he did not speak, but still felt deeply. And that was exactly what made his story different, because strength is not always in winning. Sometimes it lies in continuing, even when you know that there are parts of your life that will never be complete. Harrison Ford was not a hero in the way the films had built him. He did not have a perfect ending. He did not have a pre-written journey with clear climaxes and victories. But he had something not everyone can keep after all this resilience. A resilience that was not loud, did not need recognition, but strong enough to carry him through everything life had placed in front of him. He did not try to become a role model. He did not seek to inspire. But the very way he lived, with all that was imperfect, with all that was left unsaid, with all that he still carried, became a rare form of authenticity, a form of authenticity that needed no explanation, no beautified story, just simply existing. And perhaps that was his true legacy. Not just the roles, not just the films, but a person who had lived fully in the only way he knew, not completely hiding, but also not showing off. Not perfect, but not fake. Not invincible, but never letting himself be destroyed. When looking at Harrison Ford at 83, people no longer saw a man trying to prove anything, no longer saw a star chasing the lights, but saw a person who had gone through almost everything and still stood there. Not because he had never been challenged, but because he had never stopped. And in that silence, in the way he walked slower, spoke less, was present in a gentler way, there was something that, if one listened closely enough, could be felt very clearly. That life does not always give you the chance to repair everything, but it always gives you the chance to continue. And Harrison Ford had chosen to continue. Not with perfection, not with everything resolved, but with all that remained. And perhaps that was what we had always sensed but never spoken. He did not collapse, but he had carried more than what the world had ever seen. And that very thing, not the halo, not the titles, but the weight he still quietly carried, was what made his story stay longer, deeper, and truer than any image on the screen. And when the screen gradually darkened, when the sound faded, there was no big ending, no final statement. Only a feeling remained. A prolonged silence. An aftertaste not easy to name. As if this story did not really end, but simply paused. At a place where people were forced to ask themselves, in our own lives, what are we carrying? And do we have enough courage to continue? Just like he did, even when no one really sees, the story of Harrison Ford does not make people heartbroken because of loud collapses, but because of what quietly accumulated throughout an entire life, a childhood lacking recognition, the years when Hollywood overlooked him, the period as a carpenter building dreams for others while his own dream gradually drifted away, and the cracked relationships he never really put into words, especially the detail that he became an icon through Han Solo and Indiana Jones, but gradually lost connection with himself, is a painful paradox. The more famous he became, the more isolated he was. The plane crash in 2015 was not only a life-and-death incident, but a moment that forced him to face time and the things that could not be taken back, especially the years when he was not truly present with his family. What makes viewers feel the most poignant is not that he failed, but that he succeeded, yet still carried voids that could not be filled. However, it is right there that Harrison Ford became a very American role model. Not perfect, not invincible, but resilient, enduring, and continuing to move forward. He did not destroy himself in the face of adversity, but learned how to carry it. And that is a form of strength that American society has always honored: resilience. The lesson drawn is not to succeed at all costs, but to understand the price of success, to know how to balance between career and family, between achieving and being present. Because in the end, as the story has shown, fame can come late, money can be earned back, but time with the people you love, once lost, will never return. If the story of Harrison Ford makes you reflect on what is truly important in life, Please hit subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying us in these profound stories. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue to explore the truths behind the halo.